It was a humid summer evening in downtown Atlanta. The kind of evening when the air feels heavy against the skin and the neon lights from restaurants and boutiques sparkle as though mocking anyone who dares to walk by without the confidence of wealth. And into this setting strode a man named Marcus Ellison, a tall black man in his late 30s with broad shoulders that carried both strength and the quiet burden of a childhood filled with struggle. His dark brown skin glistening faintly with sweat as he walked down the bustling street, dressed in clothes that, to the untrained eye, seemed almost embarrassingly modest. A pair of faded khaki trousers slightly too loose around his waist, held together by a worn leather belt with a cracked buckle, a white cotton shirt that had lost its crispness years ago, and shoes that bore the unmistakable signs of having walked countless miles on pavements and dirt roads alike, their soles thinning and scuffed in places. And yet Marcus carried himself with a steady dignity, his clean-shaven face set in a calm expression, his jawline sharp, his eyes deep-set and observant, the kind of eyes that missed nothing, for life had taught him to read people not by what they said, but by what flickered across their expressions in unguarded moments. And while passers-by might dismiss him as just another man barely scraping by, those who knew him understood that Marcus was a man who had clawed his way out of poverty through relentless perseverance. His character shaped by countless nights of hunger in a cramped apartment on the south side of the city, where his single mother, Loretta Ellison, a short woman with tired eyes and hands calloused from working double shifts as a nurse, had taught him that respect for oneself is worth more than any outfit could ever signal. And so even now, as Marcus approached the entrance of Le Cordial, one of the most exclusive fine dining establishments in the area, with its glass doors framed in polished brass and a line of luxury cars gleaming in the valet section, he walked without hesitation, though inside his chest his heart beat with a mixture of anticipation and unease. For he was about to step into a place that had once seemed unreachable to a boy from his neighborhood, a place that symbolized the line between those who are served and those who serve. Marcus paused for a moment at the door, glancing at his reflection in the glass, and he thought briefly about his mother, now gone for 3 years, who would have smiled to see him here, not as an interloper, but as a man on a quiet mission, though no one else around him could possibly understand that mission yet. And as he pushed open the heavy door, the cool air from inside rushed out, carrying with it the aroma of roasted duck, garlic butter, and expensive wine, a smell that instantly told anyone entering that this was not a place for the ordinary. And yet Marcus reminded himself that he had earned his right to be here in ways that went far beyond clothing, for behind his simple appearance was a portfolio of investments, real estate acquisitions, and business deals that would shock anyone who judged him merely by the way he looked tonight. But Marcus preferred anonymity, preferring to move quietly, letting others underestimate him, because he knew that power is most effective when it is unseen until the moment it must be revealed. The host stand was manned by a young woman named Emily, slender and tall with neatly tied blonde hair, a perfectly ironed black dress uniform, and an expression trained to alternate between warmth for the rich patrons she recognized and polite disinterest for those she did not. And when Marcus approached, she glanced at him with a quick flick of her blue eyes, her lips curving slightly as if she had already decided he was out of place. And though her words were courteous, there was a crispness in her tone when she said, "Good evening, sir. Do you have a reservation?" Marcus, in his deep baritone voice, calm and steady, replied, "Yes, under Ellison." And she turned to the computer with a slight arch of her brow as if she did not expect to find it. But when his name did appear on the list, she blinked once, her professionalism snapping back into place as she gestured him toward a waiter who had been watching the interaction with thinly veiled curiosity. This waiter, named Richard, was a man in his mid-40s, stocky with thinning hair slicked back with too much gel, his round face flushed slightly from the heat of the kitchen, and he had the kind of smile that seemed insincere, stretching wide only when he thought it would be rewarded with a generous tip. And as he approached Marcus, he allowed his eyes to travel over the man's attire, lingering on the worn shoes and the creased shirt, and then glanced back toward Emily with a smirk, as though sharing a private joke, before turning to Marcus with exaggerated cheerfulness, saying, "Right this way, sir," in a tone that made the word "sir" sound like a performance rather than respect. Marcus followed without comment, his expression unchanged, but inside he noted the way Richard's shoulders shook with suppressed laughter as he led him past tables filled with wealthy couples and business executives, men in tailored suits and women in glittering evening gowns, many of whom turned briefly to glance at Marcus, their eyes narrowing or lips tightening in subtle judgments before they returned to their conversations, convinced he was nothing more than a misplaced guest. As Marcus was seated at a small table near the corner, Richard handed him a menu with a flourish, his smile widening as he said, "You'll find our dishes are quite premium," putting a pointed emphasis on the word as though to suggest Marcus might find them out of reach. And then he lingered for a moment too long, clearly expecting some sign of discomfort, but Marcus simply nodded and began to scan the menu without any visible reaction, though in his mind he was already cataloguing the behavior, not with anger, but with the patience of someone who had been underestimated his entire life. And he thought of the years when people had mocked his ambitions, when teachers had told him he was aiming too high, when employers had overlooked him for promotions, and how each insult had only strengthened his resolve to one day hold the kind of power that made mockery irrelevant. Around him, the restaurant buzzed with the quiet hum of conversation, the clinking of crystal glasses, the muted strains of a live piano played by an older gentleman in a tuxedo at the far side of the room. And Marcus allowed himself a moment to observe, his sharp eyes moving from one detail to another. The chandelier that cast golden light across the marble floor, the waiters who moved with rehearsed precision as though choreographed, the way the maître d', a tall man with a pointed moustache and an air of superiority, whispered something to another waiter while glancing at Marcus's table, prompting a ripple of quiet chuckles among the staff nearby. And though Marcus heard none of their words, he did not need to, for he had learned long ago to recognize derision by the tilt of a head, the tightening of lips, the roll of eyes that people believed went unnoticed. In that moment, Marcus was reminded of his friend David, a tall, lean man with dark curly hair and a booming laugh, who had once told him, "They'll laugh until you own the building they're standing in." Words spoken half in jest years ago when they were both scraping by, sharing cheap meals in their early 20s. And Marcus smiled faintly at the memory, for he knew tonight was not just about dinner. It was about walking into a place where his presence would challenge assumptions, and though none of the waiters could possibly imagine it, the ground beneath them was already shifting, for Marcus Ellison was not merely a guest at their table, but a man preparing to change the fate of the restaurant itself, though for now he would remain silent, letting them write the story of their own arrogance with each mocking glance and each whispered laugh. Marcus Ellison sat quietly at the table, his fingers resting lightly on the edge of the leather-bound menu. And while outwardly he appeared calm, inwardly he was observing every flicker of expression around him with the precision of a chess player studying his opponent's moves, because Marcus had long ago learned that in environments like these, where money was flaunted through designer suits and diamond necklaces, the real game was not the meal itself, but the subtle hierarchies that dictated who belonged and who did not. And as he studied the menu, he noticed Richard lingering by the service station nearby, whispering to a younger waiter, a lanky man in his 20s with messy brown hair and acne scars on his cheeks, whose name tag read Kyle. And Kyle chuckled audibly, glancing back at Marcus with poorly concealed amusement, nudging another waiter, a petite woman named Jasmine with dark hair pulled into a severe bun, who smirked as if she too found the presence of Marcus in such attire at this restaurant entertaining. And Marcus let the moment pass without reaction, though he noted each face, storing it away like pieces of a puzzle he would eventually assemble, for Marcus never forgot those who tried to demean him. Not because he was vengeful, but because he understood that the true test of character was how people treated those they believed had nothing to offer them. As he read the descriptions of dishes written in pretentious French phrases, followed by exorbitant prices, Marcus recalled how foreign such menus had once seemed to him. Back when he was a boy, living in a small, run-down apartment where meals often consisted of peanut butter sandwiches stretched over several days, and he remembered sitting at the kitchen table with his younger sister Alana, a thin girl with wide, curious eyes and braids that swung across her shoulders, both of them waiting as their mother returned from work exhausted. Her nurse's scrubs stained from long shifts, sometimes too tired even to eat. And yet, Loretta had always spoken with quiet conviction that one day her children would sit at tables where no one could look down on them, that they would rise above the stereotypes cast upon them by society. And Marcus carried that promise like a flame inside him, a flame that burned brightest whenever he was in places like this, places where that promise was tested. The clatter of silverware brought him back to the present as Richard approached again, his posture exaggeratedly formal, carrying a glass of water which he placed before Marcus with an unnecessary flourish. And he leaned in slightly, as if to make sure Marcus heard him clearly, when he said, "We do have a dress code here, sir. Jackets are usually recommended for gentlemen." The word usually dripping with condescension, and though his lips stretched into a smile, his eyes betrayed his disdain. But Marcus merely inclined his head and replied in his steady baritone, "I'll manage," before turning back to the menu, and the dismissal in his tone unsettled Richard, who lingered for a moment before retreating with a shake of his head. At a nearby table, a wealthy couple watched with interest, the woman a tall figure draped in emerald silk, her blonde hair styled into waves, her jeweled fingers clasping the stem of her wineglass, and she whispered something into the ear of the man beside her, a rotund fellow in a pinstripe suit, who laughed under his breath and glanced toward Marcus as if he were a novelty, an intrusion into their curated world of affluence, and Marcus caught their gaze but looked through them, unwilling to give them the satisfaction of acknowledgement. Across the dining room, the maître, whose name Marcus overheard as Charles, a man in his early 50s with neatly trimmed salt and pepper hair and an angular face that carried itself with the pride of someone who believed he was the arbiter of who was worthy to dine and who was not, kept casting sharp glances toward Marcus's table, his thin mustache twitching as though the very presence of Marcus disturbed the symmetry of his dining room. And once Marcus saw him whisper again to a passing waiter, prompting a ripple of stifled laughter among the staff. And though Marcus's jaw tightened faintly, he reminded himself that patience was a weapon, that endurance often spoke louder than outrage. In his mind, he drifted briefly to memories of his first failed job interview, when at 19 he had walked into a corporate office wearing his only suit, a cheap grey hand-me-down that didn't quite fit, and the hiring manager, a balding man with a dismissive tone, had barely looked at his resume before saying, "We don't think you're the right fit." The rejection not based on qualifications, but on assumptions, and Marcus had left that office with fire in his veins, vowing that one day he would build something no one could deny him, and that vow had fueled every long night of study, every risk he took when starting his small real estate ventures, every setback that forced him to rebuild stronger. And so, tonight as he sat in this restaurant, he was not merely a customer enduring ridicule, but a man measuring how far he had come from those days of being dismissed outright. Kyle approached the table next with the bread basket, his lanky frame moving with clumsy eagerness, and he set it down while muttering under his breath just loud enough for Marcus to hear. "Hope you can afford more than bread." Then forced a laugh that died quickly when Marcus looked up at him with steady eyes, not angry but piercing, eyes that seemed to strip away the young man's flimsy bravado, and Kyle flushed before retreating quickly, bumping into Jasmine, who gave him a reproachful look, though she too snickered softly as they walked away. And Marcus exhaled slowly, resisting the urge to shake his head, knowing that in time their laughter would echo differently. At that moment, the pianist shifted into a softer melody, and Marcus found his gaze drawn toward the corner where a small boy sat with his parents at a large table. The boy, perhaps no more than 8, his skin light brown, his curly hair cropped short, wearing a tiny blazer and bow tie, and the boy's eyes were fixed on Marcus, not with ridicule, but with curiosity, as though he recognized something familiar, And Marcus felt a pang of memory again, remembering himself at that age when the world seemed impossibly large and closed off, and he silently hoped the boy would grow into a world kinder than the one Marcus had known, though he knew change was slow. When Richard returned to take his order, Marcus spoke simply, choosing the duck confit and a glass of Bordeaux. His tone level, his words deliberate, and Richard scribbled it down with exaggerated flourish before saying in a stage whisper, "Excellent choice, sir. Quite ambitious." And as he walked away, Marcus could hear the faint laughter he shared with Charles, the maître d' and Jasmine, and he allowed them their moment. For what they could not imagine was that Marcus had already been in meetings with investors who could buy and sell men like Charles 100 times over, that his bank account could easily cover not just the price of the most expensive bottle of wine here, but the very building itself. And yet he chose to remain understated because the moment of revelation was always more powerful when delivered against a backdrop of ridicule. As the hum of the restaurant carried on around him, Marcus settled back in his chair, taking in the opulence of the room, the arrogance of its gatekeepers, and the quiet storm building within himself, knowing that this evening was only the beginning of a story none of them were prepared to witness. The soft clink of silverware and the mellow hum of conversation wrapped around Marcus like a cocoon of studied indifference as he sat waiting for his order, the polished marble floor reflecting the glow of chandeliers above, their golden light falling on tables draped in pristine white cloths, where couples whispered about business mergers, politics, and weekend escapes to private villas, while Marcus, dressed in clothes that looked like they had endured years of service rather than a day of luxury, sat alone at his corner table, drawing the kind of subtle attention that people pretend not to give but cannot help offering, their glances darting toward him with curiosity, disdain, or simple disbelief. For in this restaurant appearance was currency, and Marcus seemed bankrupt of it. Richard returned with a wine glass, setting it down with a theatrical spin of his wrist, pouring the Bordeaux with exaggerated care as if he were presenting a rare treasure to a man who might not appreciate its worth. And then, unable to resist the urge, he leaned slightly closer, his voice pitched just low enough to sound like a private jest. "This bottle costs more than some people's rent, sir, but I'm sure you'll enjoy it," before straightening with a smirk that he shared over his shoulder with Jasmine, who covered her laugh with her hand, while Kyle nearly doubled over at the service station and Marcus lifted the glass without a word, swirling the deep red liquid with the practiced grace of someone who had long ago learned to respect fine wines during his international business trips, inhaling the aroma before taking a measured sip, his expression unreadable, which only frustrated Richard, who had been fishing for embarrassment, and instead found himself disarmed by Marcus's composure. The duck confit arrived soon after, carried by Jasmine, who placed the plate down with delicate precision, yet could not resist letting her eyes wander over Marcus's shoes and shirt, her mouth twitching as if suppressing a laugh, and she said in a syrupy voice, "Our chef prepares this with imported herbs, very exclusive. Most of our patrons consider it a special indulgence." The pause in her words meant to highlight her assumption that Marcus was out of his depth, and Marcus simply nodded, cutting into the tender meat, savoring it without haste, allowing the flavors to linger, as he remembered the first time he had ever eaten duck, years ago when a business partner had taken him to a small French restaurant in Chicago to celebrate the closing of Marcus's first $1 million real estate deal, a memory that made him smile inwardly. For while Jasmine and Richard saw a man dressed in thrift store attire, he carried inside him the lived experience of a man who had dined across the world. At the table beside him, a trio of businessmen in navy suits whispered and chuckled, one of them, a heavy-set man with a ruddy face, muttering audibly enough for Marcus to hear, "Looks like they're letting anyone in these days." And his companions laughed quietly, clinking glasses as if their collective scorn cemented their superiority. But Marcus, steady as stone, focused on his meal, reminding himself of his mother's voice telling him that silence in the face of mockery is not weakness, but wisdom when one knows the truth will eventually surface. As the evening wore on, the staff's snickers became bolder, Kyle passing by Marcus's table, whispering something to Jasmine that made her choke back laughter, Richard once intentionally forgetting to refill Marcus's water until after serving half the room. Charles, the maître d', glancing in Marcus's direction with that perpetual look of disdain, his thin moustache twitching as though Marcus's very presence were an offence to his meticulously curated establishment. And yet, through it all, Marcus remained a calm island, his eyes occasionally scanning the room, noting not just the mockery, but also the silent observers. Because not everyone laughed. There was the young couple near the bar, the woman with dark, curly hair leaning toward her partner to whisper, her eyes filled with quiet reproach for the waiter's behavior. There was the boy Marcus had noticed earlier, who continued to glance at him with innocent curiosity, tugging at his mother's sleeve as if to ask questions she waved off impatiently. And there was even the pianist, an older man with weary eyes, whose playing seemed to take on a sharper, more defiant rhythm each time the waiter snickered, as though he too disapproved, but had learned that in such a place speaking out was a risk few dared to take. Marcus finished his meal slowly, every bite deliberate, the taste of the duck reminding him not only of how far he had come, but also of why he was here tonight. Not simply to eat, but to test the character of those who claimed to serve with dignity, and to prepare the ground for a lesson none of them would forget. He asked quietly for the dessert menu, and when Richard delivered it with a smirk, Marcus scanned the options before choosing the most decadent item, a chocolate soufflé with imported truffles, his decision causing Richard's eyebrows to lift slightly, as if he had expected Marcus to shrink from such extravagance. But Marcus simply leaned back, folding his hands together as he waited. And in that stillness, he thought back to the countless deals he had brokered in quiet boardrooms, where men in suits no different from these waiters' wealthy patrons had laughed at his proposals, only to regret underestimating him later. And he felt the familiar burn of anticipation that always came before he turned tables in his favor. When the dessert arrived, the soufflé rising perfectly from its ramekin, Marcus ate slowly, his composure unnerving to those who had mocked him, because the more he refused to break, the more their laughter began to falter, and Richard, once so bold, now found himself glancing back uncertainly as though wondering why this man in cheap clothes radiated the calm of someone entirely unbothered. Marcus finished with a sip of wine, setting the glass down with quiet finality, and when Richard brought the check, laying it down with a smirk that suggested doubt about Marcus's ability to pay, Marcus pulled from his pocket a sleek black card, the kind reserved for individuals of extreme wealth, sliding it across the table without a word, and Richard's eyes widened just slightly before he caught himself, though his flushed cheeks betrayed his surprise. And as he walked it back to the register, the whispers among the staff quieted, their earlier laughter replaced by confusion. Marcus leaned back in his chair, his gaze drifting upward toward the chandelier, and he thought of David's words again. They'll laugh until you own the building. And for the first time that night, he allowed himself a faint smile, because he knew that tonight was only the prelude to something much larger, and the time for revelation was drawing closer, each passing moment tightening the invisible noose around their arrogance. When Richard returned with the receipt holder, the black card tucked inside, his demeanor had shifted from smug to uncertain, his hands slightly tense as he placed it on the table with exaggerated politeness, his voice softer now when he said, "Thank you for dining with us, Mr. Ellison." Though the name seemed to catch awkwardly in his throat, as though he were trying to reconcile the image of Marcus's worn clothes with the undeniable proof of wealth the card represented. And Marcus, still calm, nodded once, slipping the card back into his pocket with the unhurried grace of someone who had no reason to prove himself, his eyes flicking briefly to the maître d', who had been watching the transaction closely, his lips pursed in suspicion, his moustache twitching with irritation. And Marcus knew that men like Charles despised being wrong, despised when their judgments of social order failed them, and that knowledge gave him quiet satisfaction, though he betrayed none of it outwardly as he stood from his chair, stretching his tall frame to its full height, his shoulders broad and posture regal, a presence that suddenly seemed far too commanding for the cheap clothes he wore, and he walked slowly toward the bar as though he had all the time in the world, each step deliberate measured, reminding himself that tonight was not simply about enduring their mockery, but about orchestrating a lesson in humility that none of them would forget. At the bar, he signaled for a glass of water, and the bartender, a young Latina woman named Marisol with long black hair tied neatly into a ponytail and tired eyes that hinted at double shifts, served him without judgment, her tone neutral but polite. And Marcus noticed how different her energy felt from the waiters who had mocked him, how her professionalism was born not of arrogance, but necessity, and he gave her a warm smile, thanking her sincerely, which caused her expression to soften, as though unused to being treated with such respect in a place where staff were often invisible to those they served. As he sipped his water, Marcus pulled his phone from his pocket, a sleek device with a leather case that had seen better days but still functioned perfectly. And with the same unhurried calm, he dialed a number, speaking in a low voice when the call connected. "Yes, it's Ellison. I'm at Le Cordial now. Proceed with the next step. I'll confirm once I leave." His words brief, measured, his tone carrying the weight of authority that contrasted sharply with the image of a man mocked for his clothes. And though no one nearby could hear the full conversation, Richard, passing behind him, caught just enough of the confident cadence to feel unsettled, his brow furrowing as he realized this man might not be the simple caricature he had assumed. Marcus ended the call, sliding the phone back into his pocket, and for a moment he let his eyes drift around the room, taking in the opulence with a strategist's gaze, noting not just the marble columns and gilded chandeliers, but the flow of service, the hierarchy of staff, the positioning of tables, all details that, in his mind, would soon belong to him. For Marcus was not merely wealthy, he was deliberate, and every acquisition he had ever made had begun with the same kind of quiet observation. As he returned to his table to gather his belongings, Charles intercepted him, his tall frame blocking Marcus's path, his angular face tight with controlled irritation, and in a voice polished with false civility he said, "I trust everything was satisfactory this evening, Mr. Ellison?" The name now spoken with forced politeness, and Marcus, his deep baritone calm as ever, replied, "The food was excellent. The service, however, left much to be desired." His words simple yet cutting, and the faint twitch in Charles's moustache betrayed that the critique had struck its mark, though the maître d' quickly masked it with a stiff smile, replying, "I'll be sure to pass that feedback along," before stepping aside, his posture still radiating the arrogance of a man unwilling to admit fault. Marcus walked past him without another word, but he noted the tightening of Charles's jaw, the subtle clench of his fist, and he thought again of his friend David's prophecy, that those who laugh at you will one day work for you. And as Marcus stepped out into the warm night air, the valet hurrying forward to hand him his claim ticket, he glanced back at the glowing windows of Le Cordial, the laughter and clinking glasses within now seeming hollow against the knowledge of what was to come, and he whispered under his breath, "Enjoy your night. It's the last one like this you'll have." The valet brought around a car, not the gleaming sports models that lined the drive, but a modest black sedan with a few scratches on its paint. And Marcus slid into the driver's seat with unhurried grace, nodding a thank you to the valet, who looked slightly puzzled at the contrast between the car Marcus had used inside and the car he now drove. But Marcus preferred it that way. Anonymity was armor, and he drove off into the night with the calm focus of a man who already knew the ending of a story everyone else was still writing. Back at his penthouse apartment, a spacious but understated residence overlooking the Atlanta skyline, Marcus loosened his collar and sat at his mahogany desk, where neat stacks of folders lay organized. Documents detailing the ownership structure of Le Cordial, the debts its current owner had quietly accumulated, the lease agreements that tethered it to the very real estate Marcus already controlled through shell companies, and as he sifted through the papers, he felt the familiar thrill of a plan sliding into place. For Marcus had not chosen this restaurant at random. He had known for months that it was vulnerable, its current owner desperate to offload it without losing face, and tonight had simply been the test, the final confirmation of why he would not hesitate to make it his. He opened his laptop sending quick emails to his legal team, men and women he trusted, people who respected him not for his clothes, but for his vision. And then he sat back, letting the hum of the city beyond his windows wash over him as he thought about the waiters, the maître d', their laughter echoing faintly in his memory. And he felt no anger, only certainty, because he knew that by this time next week, every one of them would look at him not with mockery, but with awe, and the restaurant that had sneered at his presence would become the stage for his quiet but resounding victory. The following days unfolded with a rhythm Marcus knew well, the measured cadence of negotiations, contracts, and the subtle pulling of strings that turned possibilities into certainties. And though, to the outside world, he continued to move with the quiet anonymity of a man who preferred to dress simply and blend into the background. Behind closed doors, he was orchestrating a transformation that would soon leave an entire restaurant staff stunned into silence. Because Marcus Ellison was not merely a wealthy man. He was a strategist who believed that the sweetest victories were those that arrived unannounced until the very moment they shattered expectations. And so he spent his mornings in his penthouse office, reviewing documents while sipping black coffee, his eyes sharp as they skimmed through the details of Le Cordial's ownership. His legal team feeding him updates about the current proprietor, a French businessman named Henri Duval, a man in his late 50s with greying hair, a portly frame, and a history of overextending his finances in an attempt to maintain the illusion of grandeur. And Marcus studied every detail of Henry's weaknesses with the patience of a hunter who knows his prey will eventually walk straight into the trap. By midweek, the deal was nearly sealed. Marcus had leveraged Duval's mounting debts, quietly acquired the liens attached to the restaurant property, and offered a generous but calculated buyout that would allow Henry to leave with some dignity while placing the restaurant squarely under Marcus's control. And the irony of it all was not lost on him, that the very men and women who had laughed at his cheap clothes were in fact working inside a building that was about to bear his name on the deed. As he signed the final preliminary agreements, Marcus thought of Loretta, his mother, and how she used to say, "Never fight to prove them wrong, Marcus. Just live so fully that they'll never doubt you again." And those words echoed through him like a steady drumbeat, fueling his resolve to make this acquisition not an act of vengeance, but a demonstration of quiet power, a reminder that dignity always outlasts derision. By Friday evening, the final papers were ready to be signed, and Marcus decided to return to Le Cordial one last time before the official transfer, his worn khakis and shirt unchanged, his shoes still scuffed, because he wanted to walk once more through that gilded door as the man they mocked before revealing himself as the man who now owned everything around them. And as he entered, the same host Emily stood at the desk, her blonde hair shining under the chandelier, her blue eyes flicking over him with that same look of disdain barely masked by professional courtesy, and she asked again, "Do you have a reservation, sir?" Her tone faintly sharper than last time, as though she had not forgotten how out of place he had seemed, and Marcus replied calmly, "Ellison," his baritone steady, and once more his name appeared, though this time it carried far more weight than she realized, for soon it would not be on the reservation list, but on the ownership papers. Richard appeared again, his slicked-back hair shining under the lights, his face flushed as always, his smile still insincere, though perhaps more cautious now after the black card incident, and he led Marcus to a table with that same strained cheerfulness, whispering something to Kyle as they passed, which made the young waiter stifle a laugh, and Marcus filed the detail away, every smirk and chuckle becoming another reminder of why his decision to buy this place was not only sound business, but poetic justice. He ordered simply again, a steak this time with a side of roasted vegetables, and as he waited, he noticed Charles, the maître d', still hovering near the entrance like a self-appointed sentinel of class, his angular face betraying irritation each time his gaze fell upon Marcus. And Marcus could almost feel the man's discomfort growing, because men like Charles thrived on control, and Marcus's calm presence, unshaken by mockery, disrupted the neat social hierarchy Charles believed he enforced. When the steak arrived, Marcus cut into it slowly, savoring each bite, But his mind was elsewhere, reviewing the contract that awaited his signature the next morning, and he could not help but let a faint smile touch his lips, because he knew that as he sat in this room being treated like an intruder, the reality was that every light, every polished fork, every bottle of wine in the cellar was already tethered to his will, and by tomorrow the law would confirm what he already knew in his bones, that Le Cordial was his. Richard noticed the smile and misinterpreted it, leaning closer with a smirk to say, "Enjoying your meal, sir? Quite an upgrade from wherever you usually dine, I'm sure." And he chuckled softly. His words meant to sting, but Marcus simply looked at him with steady eyes and replied, "You could say that." His tone neutral, yet layered with meaning Richard could not grasp, and for the first time the waiter felt a ripple of unease he could not explain. Across the room, Jasmine whispered to Kyle, her dark bun bobbing slightly as she laughed at some remark about Marcus's clothes. And Kyle shook his head in exaggerated disbelief, clearly entertained by the idea of a man like Marcus daring to sit among their wealthiest patrons. And yet Marcus remained unshaken, his composure like granite, because he knew the irony was moments from surfacing. When the bill came, Marcus once again slid the black card forward, and this time Richard did not smirk. He hesitated, his face betraying a flicker of apprehension, as though he finally understood that whatever he thought about Marcus's clothes, they did not tell the whole story, and Marcus caught that hesitation, filed it away, knowing that soon hesitation would give way to shock. Leaving the restaurant that night, Marcus stood for a moment on the sidewalk, the humid air pressing against his skin, the neon signs flickering across the street, and he looked back at the brass-framed doors, at the building glowing with false grandeur, and he whispered, "Tomorrow, everything changes," before walking calmly to his sedan, the same car that had once made the valet look puzzled, and he drove off into the night with the quiet assurance of a man who held all the cards. Back at his penthouse, he poured himself a glass of water and sat by the window, watching the skyline twinkle, his mind tracing over the years of struggle that had led to this moment, the countless times he had been dismissed, the cruel laughter of employers and strangers, the weight of poverty pressing against him in his youth. And he thought of Alana, his sister, now a schoolteacher raising her own children, and how proud she would be to know that her brother had turned the laughter of others into fuel for triumph. And he thought of Loretta, gone but never absent from his heart, and he whispered, "We made it, Mama," his deep voice carrying softly through the empty apartment. And then he leaned back, closing his eyes, allowing himself one brief moment of peace before the storm of revelation he would unleash tomorrow. The morning sun rose over Atlanta with a hazy golden glow, casting long shadows across the skyline as Marcus Ellison prepared himself for what he knew would be one of the most defining days of his life. And though his reflection in the mirror showed the same simple man in worn khakis, a faded shirt, and scuffed shoes, his eyes burned with the calm fire of purpose, because he had always believed that true power was not in what you wore, but in what you carried within. And today he carried the weight of a contract that would shift an entire world for those who had mocked him. By 9 o'clock, he was seated in a sleek downtown law office across from Henri Duval, the fading French owner of Le Cordial, whose flushed face and sweat-beaded forehead betrayed the desperation behind his polite smiles, his once proud suit hanging a little too loosely on his portly frame, and Marcus, calm as stone, signed the final papers with a steady hand, his deep baritone voice speaking only a few words, "It's done," before sliding the pen across the table. And in that moment, the restaurant, the chandeliers, the polished marble, the arrogant laughter of its staff, all of it shifted quietly into his possession. Henry, too defeated to argue, offered a weak handshake, his eyes filled with resignation. And Marcus, respectful even in victory, nodded once before leaving the office with the deed tucked securely into a leather folder, walking into the heat of the day, with the knowledge that by evening, the restaurant that had mocked him would no longer belong to Henri, or to the false social order enforced by men like Charles, but to him. He spent the afternoon in preparation, speaking with his legal team, arranging for the official announcement, but he also made one deliberate decision. He would return to the restaurant that evening, not in a tailored suit or expensive attire, but in the same simple clothes, because he wanted his revelation to strike with the full force of irony, to remind them that their laughter had been directed not at a poor man out of place, but at the very man who now signed their paychecks. When he arrived at Le Cordial that evening, the golden lights glowing in the dusk, the brass-framed doors shining as though nothing had changed, he paused for a moment on the sidewalk, feeling the humid air press against his skin, and then he pushed open the heavy doors, stepping once more into the cool, perfumed interior where the host stand was again manned by Emily, her blonde hair immaculate, her expression polished but cool, and she blinked in faint surprise when she saw him, her blue eyes narrowing as though she still could not reconcile his presence with the exclusivity of the space. And she asked automatically, "Reservation?" Her tone clipped, but Marcus simply replied, "Ellison." And when she found his name, her lips tightened, her professionalism masking irritation. Richard appeared again, his slicked-back hair gleaming, his face flushed, his insincere smile stretched wide as he led Marcus to a table. Though now there was a note of hesitation in his eyes, a flicker of memory from the black card, yet still the faint arrogance lingered as he said, "Back again, sir? You must really be enjoying your upgrade," his voice low and mocking. And Marcus, unbothered, replied evenly, "Something like that." The restaurant buzzed around them, wealthy couples laughing over wine, businessmen sealing deals over plates of lamb and duck, Charles the maître standing tall near the entrance, his angular face sharp as ever, his mustache twitching when he noticed Marcus, a look of irritation shadowing his features as though the very presence of Marcus threatened the order he so carefully maintained. Marcus ordered simply again, a meal he hardly tasted as his mind focused on what was about to unfold. And as he waited, he thought of Loretta, of her tireless hands and her quiet words of faith. And he thought of Alana, of David, of everyone who had once been dismissed alongside him. And he knew that tonight was not about vengeance, but about revelation. When his meal was nearly finished, Marcus pushed back his chair and stood, his tall frame commanding sudden attention, his deep voice carrying clearly as he said, "If I could have everyone's attention for just a moment." And conversations faltered, glasses lowered, forks stilled, the pianist's notes lingering uncertainly as patrons turned to look at the man in worn clothes who dared to interrupt the sanctity of their dining, and Marcus, calm and steady, continued. "My name is Marcus Ellison. Until this morning, this establishment belonged to Henri Duval. As of today, it belongs to me." For a moment, silence hung thick, disbelief rippling through the room, eyes widening, lips parting, and then a murmur spread like wildfire, guests turning to one another in shock, while the staff froze where they stood, Richard's face paling, Jasmine's hand flying to her mouth, Kyle's eyes wide with confusion, and Charles, the maître d', stood rigid, his jaw tightening as though trying to swallow the reality he could not control. Marcus allowed the silence to stretch, his gaze sweeping over each of them, lingering on the waiters who had laughed at him. And then he said, "I came here in simple clothes, not to test your food, but to test your character. And what I saw was arrogance, cruelty, and the belief that respect should be given only to those who wear wealth on their backs. That ends tonight." His words, calm but firm, echoed through the room like a gavel striking, and no one laughed now. Not a single chuckle dared break the gravity of the moment. Richard stammered, "Sir, I didn't mean—" But Marcus raised a hand, silencing him, his deep voice resonating with authority. "I don't need apologies. What I expect from this day forward is respect, for every patron, regardless of appearance. Because the measure of a person is not their clothes, but their dignity." He turned then to Charles, whose face had gone rigid with pride and disbelief, and he added, "And if you cannot embody that, then you have no place here." Charles's mustache twitched violently, his lips pressed into a thin line, but he could not muster words. his power stripped bare by the simple truth of ownership, and Marcus, satisfied, nodded once, signaling the end of his address. The room erupted into applause, not from the staff, who stood stunned, but from several patrons, including the young couple near the bar who had watched quietly before, the woman with curly dark hair smiling with vindicated approval, the older pianist whose weary eyes now glistened with pride as he played a triumphant chord, and even the little boy Marcus had noticed days earlier who clapped eagerly, his small voice carrying, "He owns it, Mom," with innocent excitement. And in that moment, Marcus felt a surge of warmth, not pride for himself, but for the lesson that had been delivered, the reminder that appearances deceive, but dignity reveals the truth. He sat back down, finishing his wine slowly as the staff scrambled to recover, Richard now hovering nervously, Jasmine avoiding his gaze, Kyle fumbling with plates, Charles retreating stiffly toward the back, and Marcus let them stew in the reality of their arrogance, because he knew the true weight of revelation takes time to sink in. When he finally stood to leave, the entire restaurant seemed to watch him, some with awe, some with shame, and Marcus walked calmly toward the door, pausing only once to glance back at the chandelier, the marble, the polished brass, all of it now his. And he thought of his mother again, whispering softly, "This is for you, Mama," before stepping into the warm night air, the city alive around him, his heart steady, his dignity intact, and his victory complete.